Welcome to a suburban village that has lost over half of its peak population, Robbins. And since the city has lost so many people, much of the city looks abandoned.
My first thought after driving through this place was that vegetation has really taken over what used to be a denser urban area. Given the eye test, Robbins doesn't appear to be that far away from becoming the next Cook County Forest Preserve. Heck, today, Robbins gives the concept of having a cabin in the woods a whole new meaning. You can even see it from a satellite photo, like you don't even need labels on the map to see where Robbins is with all of the trees that have grown over time to fill in the vacant lots. Where we start the video is at the village border with Crestwood. Robbins is about 20 miles southwest of the Chicago Loop, or about halfway between Joliet and the Chicago Loop along the RI line. The population of the suburb peaked in 1970 at around 9,000 people. Since then, it's declined significantly, and it won't be long until that number gets below 4,000. Well, let's move on to some positives before we go any further, as three-time NBA champion and 13-time NBA All-Star Dwayne Wade is from here. What up, D-Wade? Wade spent his teenage years playing hoops at Richards High School in Oak Lawn, several miles north of here, but Robbins is where he lived for his teenage years. A 2016 article from the Chicago Tribune quotes some of the longtime natives, saying how he would jog all day long along the streets of Robbins during the summer to train. There's other things that Robbins is proud of too, such as being the second black incorporated town in the northern states after another Illinois city, Brooklyn, which is just east of St. Louis, Missouri. Robbins also had the first black-owned airport in the United States. But when you drive around Robbins today and see the place, there's no denying that the village's best days are in the past. Gang violence and corruption over the years has made Robbins a much less desirable place to live, which can be said about a lot of other declining South Chicago suburbs. Most recently, the residents of Robbins have been dealing with a series of water main breaks and other problems with the water infrastructure, similar to Dixmoor in my last video. Dixmoor has had a rougher go of it, but the problem is strongly present in Robbins as well. Apparently, the water tower was leaking. Well, estimates to repair the aging water infrastructure in Robbins calculates out to be $40 million, so a $2 million grant here and a $4 million grant there isn't going to help much. Robbins water mains were first installed back in the early 1900s, and with Robbins mostly being a poverty-stricken community throughout most of its lifetime, leaders over the years neglected the system by not maintaining it, whether it be politicians taking some of the taxpayer money for their own personal gain, or whether the taxpayer funds over the years were used on other services. The water infrastructure was largely forgotten about, and today's residents of Robbins are forced to pay the price for it. Oh, here's another story out of Robbins. This is a criminal story, but it leads to more corruption. A major story in February of 23 broke out when a 71-year-old man was killed in a fatal hit and run. The man was pulling out of a church parking lot in Robbins when three teenage boys who originally were reported to all be 13 years old were flying by in a stolen Kia. Despite the teenagers stealing a Kia and despite them driving recklessly and fatally killing an innocent 71-year-old man, the teens were released shortly after being arrested. It's Illinois law to release juveniles after a 24-hour period if they can't gather up enough evidence to charge them within that time period. Well, trial took place in May, 3 months after the incident, and no charges were filed against the teenagers who were not only driving a stolen Kia, but it was driven recklessly and it killed somebody. No charges, people. None. And it happened here in Robbins. Plenty of people on Twitter were sounding off in frustration. Rightfully so. I mean, it could have been their family member next. Wait, what's that? Philip Horner? You say that it was a lie to say that the killers, the three teenagers in the stolen Kia, were 13 as originally stated by police on scene? Yeah, Philip was right. It was noted later on in the case that the three boys who were in the stolen Kia were not 13. One was 17, another was 15, and the youngest was 14. At the time, village spokesman Sean Howard claimed that the police had done all of the investigation work that they could have possibly done before determining that all three of the teenagers wouldn't be charged. He also didn't have an answer for why the report was originally that the three teenage boys were 13, when the correct information didn't come out until a few months later. Well, that leads to the next problem, as the investigation of the crash was crooked from the start. Robbins Police Chief David Shepard, who had 30 years of experience doing police work in Cook County, moved the victim's vehicle into a large building that was owned by the village. Shepard moved it there because it was going to be a while until state police could complete the investigation of the crash, and keeping the vehicle out of the elements helps with the investigation process. Village Mayor Darren Bryant had a problem with that, though, because the building that Shepard moved the vehicle into also housed public works vehicles, so not long after the car was moved into the large building, Bryant wanted the victim's vehicle removed, as it was blocking public works vehicles. According to the Chicago Tribune, Shepard contacted the public works director, who then told Shepard that no vehicles were being blocked. But the mayor had his way, and eventually the vehicle was moved to the Robbins impound lot, which is outdoors and not ideal when it was then exposed to rain and snow. Well, the crash happened in February of 23, and Shepard was terminated from his position as Robbins police chief in April of 23. This is despite the police department in Robbins being the best that it had been in a long time. Shepard became the police chief in October of 21, and since then, homicides went down by 90%. When Shepard came to Robbins, there were only 11 police officers in the department. By the time of his firing, there were 46. Shepard even spent $6,000 of his own money on safety equipment for his fellow Robbins officers. He was doing literally everything that you would want a police chief to do for a struggling community. Yet, he was still fired. Bryant's reasoning for firing the U.S. Navy veteran was that the village wanted some broader goals met, and he believed that a change was needed in order to reach those goals. Yeah, okay, Darren Bryant. The police department is as good as it's ever been. The community loved their police chief. A black community at that, during a time when community tensions with police officers across the country are seemingly at their peak? Yeah, okay, Mayor Bryant. Okay. Meanwhile, some of these homes, man, just rotting away while vegetation takes them over. Like I said, cabin in the woods, a whole new meaning. Well, Shepard went on to file a lawsuit against both the village of Robbins and the mayor for illegally firing him. Within the lawsuit, Shepard claims that Bryant wanted to hire a potential officer who was 65 years old, which is past the age limit for police officers. Additionally, the 65-year-old guy has a well-documented sketchy past. During his time with working for the village of Harvey, Frank Sanders failed to disclose his termination, and he has an alleged bribery to his name. Well, Mayor Bryant hired Sanders to be a police officer anyway. Sanders even brought in somebody else's pick for the urine test. Yet, despite all of that, Robbins Mayor Darren Bryant won the 2023 Mayor of the Year Award by the From the Roof Down organization. 2023 Mayor of the Year. What a joke. Additionally, a report came out not long before me uploading this video stating that Robbins has hired 46 police officers who had previously been fired in other police departments for wrongdoing. That's more hires of that kind than any other police department statewide. Is there an award for that too? Does Robbins get an award for that? An award? Anywhere? Anywhere? No? Okay. Well, corruption goes way back in Robbins. Almost 10 years before Shepard took over the department, Mel Davis was the police chief. Davis was the successor of Johnny Holmes, who resigned after his second DUI arrest. Well, in 2013, Davis hired Captain Douglas J. Smith, who supposedly was a police officer with 30 years of experience in Georgia, California, and various other places along the East Coast. Only that was a lie. Not only did state investigators find zero evidence of Smith having any prior experience as a police officer, but Smith never went through the proper training to carry a firearm on duty. He even wore a fake badge while on the staff. A fake LAPD badge at that. In fact, It was this one that was used in the Dragnet TV show from the 1950s. Well, needless to say, Davis was fired upon the discovery. To add insult to injury, that same year, 2013, there were 170 rape kits that were found by the Cook County Sheriff's Department in the Robbins Police Department, just sitting around when they should have been sent out for investigation. Some of the cases were from as far back as 1986, or 27 years prior to Cook County finding the stash. From 1986 to 2013, Robbins reported only 72 rapes, despite there being evidence of there being 100 more than that over the same time period. This, of course, led to lawsuits against Robbins in the following years when victims found out that their cases were not being properly investigated. The reason why Robbins never investigated these cases is believed to be because it costs anywhere from $1,000 to $1,500 per case to be investigated, and not doing their part to send them in was a slimy cost-cutting move by the village. 2013 took a toll on not just the community, but also then longtime Mayor Irene Brody, as she resigned in response to everything that had occurred. With the heavy string of corruption with mayor after mayor after mayor, that takes a toll on the community. In Robbins' case, not only are you seeing it with the village having only half of its 1970 peak population, but also with the water infrastructure that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. That's being exposed after years upon years of neglect. Crime has, for the most part, been really high too in this community, with the exception of a few years with David Shepard being the police chief. Only time will tell what the future is for the village of Robbins, but just like with all of the other dinky little south suburban communities, I wouldn't be surprised that if sometime in my lifetime, Robbins gets annexed by maybe Blue Island or one of the other nearby suburbs, because it won't have a choice. I think the population is going to continue to drop and drop and drop, and at some point, something's got to give. That's the way I see it. Back in a few. So I've referenced Robbins' peak population a few times so far in this video. Want to hear it again? No? Well, too bad. 1970 was the peak with nearly 10,000 residents, but it's well below that now. It looks very similar to other south suburban villages and cities. Other places like Harvey, Dixmoor, Phoenix, Fort Heights, and Chicago Heights have all seen a loss of about half of their peak populations. Today, the population of Robbins is 4,500, and the median household income is $47,000 per year. Only 12% of adults 25 and older hold a bachelor's degree or higher, and the median value of owner-occupied housing units is $105,000. Lastly, the poverty rate is 34.1%. On to the crime rates now, and the violent crime rate in Robbins is 360 for every 100,000 residents, while the property crime rate is 2,100 for every 100,000 residents. Both of those numbers are right around the national average, but once again, remember the police didn't report over 100 rapes from 1986 to 2013, so you have to wonder how much crime goes on in Robbins that goes unreported. And historically, the crime rates in Robbins have been really high. Well, let's move on and talk about the history of Robbins, shall we? Robbins was founded later than most other Calumet region municipalities were. Most were founded in the late 19th century, but it wasn't until 1917 that Robbins was officially incorporated. Development didn't start to occur until 1910, when then real estate agents, Henry and Eugene Robbins, built the first subdivisions in which they marketed the houses to descendants of slaves who migrated north during the Great Migration. So, right off of the bat, the place was a black community, and Robbins is the oldest black community in the greater Chicago area. It's the second oldest in the northern states, after the town of Brooklyn, Illinois, right outside of East St. Louis. Property in Robbins cost as little as $90, and for the first few decades or so, Robbins lacked paved streets, sewers, and other amenities that were afforded in the more developed areas of Chicago. The land value for Robbins was never high, as the village is located in a floodplain. When the land started to be developed, black families saw Robbins as a place to live in peace, as they wouldn't have to deal with as much discrimination from whites by living in an all-black community, so it made sense. That being said, it wasn't long until the community started to spring up with homeowners, in which many of them had their own gardens and livestock farms. Clare Boulevard was the main street, and it was full of grocery stores, shops, churches, and other businesses, unlike what we see here today. The majority of black families who settled in Robbins were working-class families. For a long time, Robbins had a rural setting despite being in such close proximity to both Blue Island and Chicago. Outside of being a floodplain, Robbins was in a great location geographically with all of the industry within the greater Calumet region, so people who lived in Robbins could work at the nearby steel factories, which offered great opportunities for black families to make a living where they couldn't find anything like that in the southern states. Robbins was able to grow from around 420 people in 1920 to 1,300 by 1940. In between that time, in 1931, two black aviators who started their pursuit in Detroit established what was the Robbins Airport. It was the first black-run airport in the United States. The airport developed as other airstrips in the Chicago area denied black pilots to fly in and out of them. It was short-lived, as a storm ruined it in 1933 and it was never rebuilt, but its legacy lives on. John Robinson and Cornelius Coffey were the two men who founded the Robbins Airport. They both previously tried to enroll in the Chicago-based Curtis Wright Aeronautical University, but they were denied because of their skin color. Coffey ended up suing the school, while Robinson was hired as a janitor where he would often listen in on classes. Robinson one day was able to gather up a magazine at the school where inside was an offer for a build-it-yourself airplane that cost $300. Back to that in a second, as this is the Robbins Historical Society Museum. It was opened in 2010 through efforts by Robbins native Tyrone Haymore. It's a small museum, but it's something at least to remind people of the rich history that has taken place in Robbins. I mean, heck, D. Wade, the first black-owned airport that was built so that two black men early on could pursue their dreams of being pilots when they were being denied opportunities everywhere else because of their skin color. Yeah, that's something to be proud of for sure, and there's other notable people that I'll mention later who have strong ties to Robbins. Based on what I could find, the Robbins Airport was actually located right here, where I am right now along Lawndale Avenue. It wasn't very big, and the hangar could house only one airplane. It was made of cheap materials and it was built by volunteers, hence being ruined in a storm only a few years after the opening date and never being rebuilt. Anyway, back to the story, as Robinson purchased the plane kit he found in the magazine to where he, Coffey, and several other men built the plane. The plane kit didn't come with an engine, so they used the engine from Coffey's motorcycle. Well, an instructor from the school took notice of Coffey's and Robinson's project and wanted to give the airplane a try. The instructor then flew the home-built plane from Washington Park in Chicago, and it flew just like any other plane. Well, Coffey then dropped the racial discrimination lawsuit and was accepted into the school along with Robinson. The school even established a new class in which both of the men were the only students. After graduation, they were asked to instruct other black students for the school. The two didn't stay with Curtis Wright Aeronautical University for very long, as racial tensions grew among the other white students. Coffey and Robinson then started their own school called the Challenger Air Pilots Association. For this school, they wanted their own airport, but the city of Chicago wouldn't give the men a permit based on their skin color. They then tried heading south to the newly incorporated town of Robbins, and in 1931, the Robbins Airport was opened. After the storm destroyed the Robbins Airport in 1933, Coffey and Robinson went in different directions. Coffey started the Coffey Flying School at an airport elsewhere in suburban Chicago, 87th and Harlem, in which some of the Tuskegee Airmen learned how to fly at his school, in which 10 of the Tuskegee Airmen grew up in Robbins. Robinson, on the other hand, volunteered for the Ethiopian Army when they were battling Italy in 1935. Robinson died in a plane crash in Ethiopia in 1954. Well, someone else who had a hand in the development of the Robbins Airport was Bessie Coleman, who was the first black woman with a pilot's license in the United States. She gained it in 1921 by identifying as a Native American, as that helped her obtain the license. Coleman ended up dying 5 years later in a plane crash. Other notable people from Robbins includes actress Nichelle Nichols, who recently passed away in July of 22 at age 89, but she played Lieutenant Uhura in Star Trek. She was one of the first black women who starred in a role in a major production. Actress Keke Palmer is also from Robbins. So yeah, Robbins has a pretty proud history. Unfortunately, Robbins also has, just as equally, if not more, of an unproud history. Robbins has always been a village with a high poverty rate, and although the homes had running water, paved streets and sewers didn't come until the 1950s. That and other improvements put the village of Robbins into a heavy load of debt, as the village couldn't really afford all of the upgrades that they were implementing. The homes in Robbins were pretty substandard as well, with indoor plumbing and electricity being non-existent in many of them as late as the 1960s. Some documentation describes the homes in Robbins as being shacks. Many of the residents were employed by the nearby factories, but when plant layoffs came around in the 1970s, that made life that much harder in Robbins. Despite the economic troubles, black families continued to move to Robbins, in which the peak was once again around 9,600 in 1970. Reasons being that it was, for a long time, one of the very few places that black people could afford to own a home in the greater Chicago area. Before the peak happened in 1970, in 1954, the Richard Flowers public housing projects were built in Robbins. The projects were actually an upgrade as they replaced substandard housing. The Richard Flowers homes had electricity and up-to-code indoor plumbing, something that many of the homes didn't have before. Many of the people who lived in the previous homes ended up moving to the new projects. It wasn't long until Chicago-based street gangs started to gain a presence in Robbins as well, which is the start of the village's long history with violent crime. The Black Pea Stones were the first gang to have a strong presence in Robbins, followed by the Black Disciples and the Vice Lords. On Halloween night in 1970, the website Chicago Gang History mentions how there was a shooting where 5 houses were hit, including the home of then-Mayor Marion Smith, who was struck in the leg. Of course, the Richard Flowers project soon became a hotspot for gang activity and gang-related violence because pretty much every housing project in the Chicago area seemed to be during this time. Well, shortly following the shooting on Halloween night, there was a lot of violence at the Richard Flowers projects. And within a few days of the Halloween shooting, there were 2 officers from Robbins who were arrested for shooting and killing 2 juveniles who they mistook as gang members. The officers ended up not being charged, rather they were just suspended for a short time. And here we are at the Richard Flowers projects. Well, the shooting of course started to raise tensions between the police and not only street gangs, but also the broader community. Then Robbins Police Chief Porter McCamey had not only been accused of police brutality multiple times, but he was also charged for theft in May of 1970. He ended up getting fired the following year. Throughout the 70s, the police force continued to dismantle through corruption, and street gangs continued to gain control of the community through forms of violence and selling drugs. Robbins was said to be a lawless community during the 70s as police lost all control. Street gangs really liked working in Robbins too, as it was considered to be one of the best places to sell drugs and make a profit outside of Chicago proper. It also helped that Robbins was not that far from the central gang activity in the south side of Chicago. The police officers of Robbins were said to have been criminals themselves, whether it be through buying and selling some of the drugs too, letting crimes go through bribes from the gangs, or through brutally beating suspects when arresting them. In 1977, Samuel Coleman was brought into Robbins to help turn around the police department. At the time, there were 15 officers. One of Coleman's initial discoveries were that some of the police officers didn't even have a driver's license. Not only that, but Robbins' police officers were stealing cars, robbing businesses. Sometimes they were armed robberies. Money spending was mishandled, unaccounted for, and missing. Confiscated drugs were nowhere to be found, and police brutality complaints were through the roof, as some of the officers treated some of the arrests as they were boxing matches or something. General police files were unorganized, and the response times to emergency calls were terrible. Coleman did a lot of work to discover a lot of what was wrong within the department, but eventually all of the police officers were fired, including Coleman. So with all of the police officers being fired, the Cook County Sheriff's Department was forced to patrol Robbins, and despite Coleman being fired, he continued to investigate the corruption on his own. Well, Gordon Fearson, who worked for the Cook County Sheriff, was the new police chief in Robbins, and Coleman found out that Fearson took down a local business unethically, and Coleman tried to stop it, but Coleman ended up being arrested for impersonating a police officer. Coleman seemed like a good guy trying to do the right thing, kind of like one of the more recent police chiefs in Robbins, David Shepard, who I talked about earlier. Well, just like Shepard in recent years, Coleman filed a lawsuit against the village of Robbins in 1982 for wrongful firing, as he was the one that uncovered much of the root problems. Additionally, a few years later in 1984, Fearson and former Mayor Marion Smith ended up suing the village of Robbins. The village then turned around and opened up a lawsuit against an attorney for $2 million, as he didn't show up in court and didn't come to aid the village in the 1970s when he was the village's attorney. So yeah, things were at peak chaos in Robbins throughout the late 70s and early 80s, and things continued that way all the way through the 90s. The economy also continued to decline with the layoffs at the nearby factories. Small businesses in town were forced to close as well due to the high crime rates and overall poor economy among the village. In the 70s, residents started to leave after continued growth for 5 decades, and people have been fleeing from Robbins ever since. The police department never solved their own issues either, and criminals kept getting away with their crimes. Additionally, Robbins has always been a municipality that hasn't had much money to work with to improve things, and according to a Chicago Tribune article from 1987, the village was on the verge of bankruptcy. That year, the village was ordered by the U.S. Court of Appeals to pay $575,000 in damages that were assessed to the lawsuits that Coleman had against the village and also the lawsuits that Fearson and Mayor Marion Smith had against the village. This is despite Robbins already paying Coleman $140,000 previously with an additional $49,000 legal fee. Unfortunately, things in Robbins continued to be a mess throughout the 80s and 90s. The lawsuits limited the village's budgets even more than they were already limited. The fire department was no longer running due to operating expenses. In 1987, all of the firefighters walked out due to low wages. And all of that drama in the police department through mayor after mayor after mayor and decade after decade after decade has led to the Robbins that we see here today. A lot of it is empty, dying, and decaying. We're in the one neighborhood that is really still intact, and even here, there's abandoned homes popping up here and there. The village has simply just never been able to get out of its own way. Robbins even earned the nickname of Rockville in the late 80s due to the amount of crack and cocaine that could be found in the municipality. That's not to say that there weren't people who have tried. Coleman, Charles Clark, who was the police chief in the later half of the 80s, seemed to have put forth some strong efforts with little results, and, of course, David Shepard until his firing in 2023. Plus, there's about a dozen more examples of corrupt police officers throughout the 90s and early 2000s in this village. It's unfortunate. Well, guess what, people? It is now that time. What did we learn in this video? We learned that you can't always trust the judgment by the From the Roof Down organization, just like how you can't always trust your homeowners association. But you can always trust Chris's livability score. That's right, I'm here for you. Well, the first category is education. Robbins residents attend Richards High School in Oaklawn, which is several miles to the north. Academically, the school is just a tad below average, but it's not near as bad as some of the academic performances that you'll see in schools located in Thornton and Bloom Townships, or many of the areas that I've covered so far in southern Cook County. Education, amazingly, for a community such as Robbins, gets a 10 out of 20. Crime is next, and while the crime rates are lower today than they ever have been before, I know that I can't trust that all of the crimes are getting reported in Robbins. Plus, the village fired the best police chief that the community has ever had, and it's disturbing to know that no charges were filed against the 3 juveniles who ended up fatally killing a 71-year-old man because they were in a stolen Kia and driving recklessly. Crime gets an 8 out of 20. Downtown is next, in which there is no downtown Robbins, at least there is no downtown that's left of Robbins, so that gets a 0 out of 20. It's no secret that the economy has its struggles in the far southern region of Chicagoland. Economy gets a 4 out of 20. Recreational opportunities are far and few in between. You have to drive quite a ways before you get to some of the better Cook County forest preserves, so it gets a 3 out of 20. Next up is history, in which Robbins does have some impressive history for the black community that's worth preserving. People ask me all the time why it's factored into why a place is livable, and I've mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again. It's because history can generate community pride so much to where people are motivated to gather up funds to save certain buildings, or in Robbins' case, the community, which can be an economic opportunity in its own unique way, so Robbins gets a 12 out of 20 on the history score. It would be a little bit higher if there was a historic downtown of some sort. Amenities is next, and while there is nothing offered in Robbins really, the neighboring suburb of Crestwood to the west has a wider selection of amenities than what you can find anywhere else in far southern Cook County. Given Robbins' close proximity to Crestwood, amenities gets a 6 out of 20. Lastly, cost of living is the biggest strength of Robbins, but there's a price to pay currently with the water utility situation and with all of the corruption that has gone on in Robbins over the years. That price is always paid by the taxpayers of the community, so despite the really cheap housing, cost of living gets a 15 out of 20. All in all, the Chris livability score is 58 out of 160, putting it towards the top of the list out of all of the Illinois cities that I've done this for so far. Enjoy it while it lasts, because it won't always be at the top of the Illinois list. So far, it doesn't take much to be towards the top of that list. Well hey, if you enjoyed this video, there's another video that I made on a similar place that happens to be not far from Robbins, and you can watch that video here. Peace.